Hello and welcome to another video in Foundations of Maternal and Newborn Health. In today's video, we're going to be continuing on our topic of anemia and talk a little bit more about how to measure iron levels in the blood. There are different blood tests to measure iron in its different forms in the body, and these different forms of iron can tell us a little bit more about the type of anemia that a patient might have or how bad the patient's anemia is. So the first test that I will talk about is serum iron. Serum iron. And this one's probably the most intuitive. This is just the total amount of iron within the blood. So total iron in the blood. The next type of iron that we'll talk about is transferrin. Transferrin. And we talked in the first video about iron absorption, that iron is actually carried from the gut, from your intestines to your bones. It needs to be carried around by a helper protein, by a protein that carries it through the blood, and that's transferrin. So this is a carrier protein for iron. And so if you see fair, this usually means iron. And trans usually means across or to transport. And so in this case, this is a transport. And so this protein, transferrin, transports iron. So the other common test for iron is ferritin. And again, we have fair here, so we know it's talking about iron, or it's probably talking about iron. And ferritin is a little bit different. Ferritin is actually measuring your storage of iron. And so ferritin is actually found very little in the blood, so there's not much in blood. And so it's mostly actually found in the tissues of your body, so things like your muscles or your liver or your spleen, those solid organs, they're what's actually holding on to this ferritin. But we can measure the amount of ferritin in the blood, and the amount of ferritin in the blood tells us about how much ferritin is being stored in the organs of our body. So if the ferritin levels are really high in the blood, that means we're storing a lot of ferritin holding iron inside of our organs as well. So there would be lots of ferritin in your muscles or your liver if the ferritin levels are very high in the blood. And if the ferritin levels are very low in the blood, that means there's not very much ferritin holding onto iron inside of our muscles or livers or again in those organs. Right. And so this is kind of an indirect way of measuring how much iron we've stored in our body. Right. We can also measure hemoglobin directly. Hemoglobin. Right. And again, if you think back to our first video on iron absorption, hemoglobin is really the used form of iron. So this is the functional or used form of iron, functional iron, and most of the iron in our body is found in the form of hemoglobin. So this is most of the iron, right? And so there's lots of hemoglobin in the blood. Right? And if you think back to our gas exchange video, hemoglobin carries oxygen. So the iron in hemoglobin is actually what's carrying the oxygen. It's what's holding on to the oxygen. So the last way that we can measure iron is actually by hematocrit. or red blood cell count. Red blood cell count. Right. And I've grouped these together. They are technically different tests, but both of these are just measuring amount of red blood cells. Amount of red blood cells. And so again, red blood cells carry hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is really how we hold most of our iron. So in a way, counting the amount of red blood cells is really counting the amount of iron that we have. And so all of these different blood tests tell us in different ways how we're using our iron. And so hopefully the big takeaway from this video is not to memorize what all of these are per se, but more so that if you see these results or you see these tests being run, you know that all of these are just measuring iron. You can actually use these different measures of iron levels to tell us what type of anemia we might be dealing with. Again, you can think back to the fact that there are many different causes of anemia, but for our sake, all that's important to know is that all of these are measuring iron, and if any of them are too low, that's a sign of anemia.